guys who really got this field off the ground and into more of the social, into people's awareness, right? You can now go to college, you can study sociology, and these are the guys that really instituted that. But before we look at these 5 men, we need to understand what are the factors, mostly societal factors, that led to the creation of sociology. So what was going on within society, right? It's a historical, we're looking at this a little bit historically. What was going on that led to sociology arising? Okay? So there's a couple different things. I think the one key thing that we want to focus in on here is going to be the Industrial Revolution. Okay, do we know anything about the Industrial Revolution? No? Should I go tell Miss Birchie? She would not be. Alright, so the Industrial Revolution is this movement that starts in Europe in the early 19th century, so the early 1800s, and then it eventually makes its way over to America. But what the Industrial Revolution did is this is the rise of manufacturing. This is the rise of materialism. This is where people start to leave their farms and they start to build factories, and we start to see mass production of goods. Okay, so the things like shoes, like watches, like eventually cars, these are all goods that can be produced on a large scale because of the Industrial Revolution. And so some of the repercussions of the Industrial Revolution are these 3 aspects here, right? So the first one would be urbanization. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, much of society were farmers, right? We were mainly an agricultural people. Most people had to spend their lives working the fields to produce food for everyone else, right? It took a lot of people. We couldn't work very much land, right? Farms are very small at this time, so you had to have a large percentage of the population working to create food. And the Industrial Revolution changes that, right? Where are factories located? In the country or in towns? In towns, right? So people are moving to where the jobs are. As these factories start to arise within cities, jobs are created, and now there's a demand for labor. So people begin to move in from the countryside into the cities, right? So urbanization is one of the key components, because all of a sudden you now have large groups of people all living within a relatively small space, right? Where people used to be spread out, you get towns. This is when you start to see cities become like they have a population of 1 million plus, right? As people move in. Another aspect is the formation of social classes. Okay, so sociology is really concerned about how social classes interact with one another and how those social classes are formulated. So where here, prior to the Industrial Revolution, you used to have the people at the top, right? Like think aristocrats, and then people at the bottom, peasants who would work the fields. From the Industrial Revolution, we now have a working class, we now have a middle class, and we now have an upper class. Okay, so those 3 distinctions of society all come about because of this. And then we also see large-scale immigration, because again, you go to where the jobs are. So it's not just people moving in from the countryside to the cities, but it's people moving from country to country, right? If there's a lot of jobs in England or in America, you're going to see people moving from Eastern Europe, right? They're going to come from Southeastern Europe. They're going to move to where the jobs are. So you get a lot of cross-cultural components going on here. People from different societies and different cultures all coming together and mixing around and mingling with one another. We also, around this time, this is post-Enlightenment, so you have a lot of secularization and the rise of the scientific method. So people are starting to begin to understand how the natural world works around them. We're understanding concepts like physics and advanced mathematics and how gravity works. And so we're looking, and people are very heavily focused on trying to explain the natural world through science. And so do we know what the scientific method is? Have you guys covered that in some of your science courses? Right, where you analyze something, you come up with a hypothesis, then you go through and you do an experiment to try to prove or disprove your hypothesis, and you analyze the data, and then it can be reproduced, right? You can do it again to reinforce the validity of your findings. This is where sociology really takes that and runs, right? The whole idea of the scientific method is very instrumental to the development of sociology. And then also, Europe at this time is full of political upheaval. Okay, the French Revolution happens right before sociology takes off. But then all throughout the 19th century in Europe, there's almost constant warfare. There's a lot of countries being formulated. Germany was formed in this time. And then you also have just wide-scale political upheaval. People becoming more democratic. Political parties start to take hold. They start to gain power throughout Europe. And so all these kind of swirl together and mix to create this really unique society that humanity had never seen before. Right? Life in the 18th or 19th century was drastically different than it had been at any other time in human history. Does anyone have any questions about these aspects? No? All right, so the first sultan we're going to look at is a guy named Auguste Comte. I don't know. If you speak French and you know how to pronounce that, please let me know. I took 4 years of high school Spanish and remember nothing. So, anyway, Auguste, he was a French philosopher, and he is seen as the father of the founder of sociology, right? So if we were making a Mount Rushmore or a pyramid, he would be at the top, right? He's the first guy to really take this and run with it. And he grew up in the aftermath of the French Revolution. Okay, so he was alive at the time of Napoleon. He was there for the Napoleonic Wars, and he saw how that warfare and that political upheaval changed French society. He saw a first-hand account there for the before and there for the after. And he wrote a lot about the impact that this had on society. And as far as his, the main contribution to what we would eventually call sociology, because he didn't give the name to this field, right? A lot of times with early founders, they don't formalize the field. They're more the ones that spark the inquiry. They put things out there that allow the field to take off. But he developed two main fields, this idea of social statics and social dynamics. Now, social statics, these are the forces that hold society together. So if you're studying a culture, you're studying society, you want to look at how do these people retain control? How do they keep from breaking apart? How do they keep from rebelling against one another? What provides some form of structure to their society? And these would be social statics, okay? Things that keep society together. Social dynamics is the opposite. These are the forces that cause societies to change. So remember, growing up after the French Revolution, he sees a lot of societal changes, and so he's studying these things. What causes societies to change and evolve and grow over time? Okay. The next guy we're going to look at is a contemporary of Auguste, whatever. His name is Herbert Spencer. Now, Herbert Spencer, he's an Englishman, an English sociologist, and he is one of the ones that this is when sociology first gets termed sociology, right? So remember, Auguste, he didn't necessarily use the term sociology, didn't see it as a specific scientific field, but at this time with Spencer, we start to see it become a little more concrete. Now, Spencer is heavily influenced by the theory of evolution. He's an early proponent or an early advocate for the theory of evolution. He actually is doing some writings and putting this out before Darwin's book came out in 1856, The Origin of Species. So he takes a different approach. Darwin is very much like natural selection, evolution. Spencer has some different ideas on evolution, but we're not going to go into those. But mainly what I want you to know from this is that he saw society as evolving from simple to complex. So if you imagine like a pre-industrial world where most people are agriculturalists, there's really only like 2 or 3 jobs that one could have, right? You could either be a farmer, or you could be an aristocrat, or you could be a politician, right? As society progresses and industrialization allows more people to take on more jobs, we start to see different sets of jobs arise. All of a sudden now you can be a shoemaker, now you can be someone who produces cloth, now you can be someone who owns a factory. And Spencer saw this as society getting more complex. As more jobs start to arise, as more specialization and individualization occurs, he saw that as society becoming more and more complex. And he also coined the term survival of the fittest. Okay, that's a term that usually gets equated to Darwin and his theory of natural selection, but it was actually Spencer who said survival of the fittest. Do we know what that phrase means? Survival of the fittest? Can someone tell me what it is?
Is it like, to survive you have to be like, work for it?
Yeah, so the people who work the hardest, they're going to be the strongest. So you're going to get more money, and that more money is going to allow you to get more food, and that more food is going to allow you to become stronger. Right? It's easier to think about in terms of the animal world. Right? If you have a pack of lions, which lion is going to be the one who produces the most offspring? Right? The lion who's weak or the lion who's strong? The strong lion, right? Because they're the ones who are going to get the most food, they're going to have the most children, and they're going to pass on the most of their genes. Right? We can think about society in the same way. That survival of the fittest, the one who is best suited for their environment is going to survive the best. And then he also saw the history of humanity as one of progress. He thought, and he's kind of been proven wrong because we haven't necessarily seen this, but that humans will continue to better themselves. He had this concept that eventually we would become this, like a higher order being, a being who is better suited to live on this world as we continue that evolutionary progression. Okay, any questions? So anything I need to go back over? No? Okay. Our next guy, and if you are familiar with any of these, it's probably Karl Marx, right? He is often seen as the father of socialism and communism, but he's also a sociologist. I think a lot of people don't understand or realize that. But he was mainly concerned with these two concepts, right? The concept of freedom and the concept of labor. He posited or put out there that there were societal constraints that inhibited our freedoms, right? That humans in our pure state, in our natural, in our free state, we can do whatever we want, right? We can go to bed when we want, we can eat when we want, we can eat what we want. But he said that society, and especially this post-industrial world, where people are now having to clock in to work, they clock out of work. Work tells them when to be there and when they can leave. It tells them when they can have free time. He said that this is all constraints that society has put on our freedom. Right? This system that we now live in doesn't allow us to live in a pure state of freedom. He also saw that labor was distributed unequally. He saw that there were some people in society that didn't have to work at all. These are the rich people, the people at the top, right? They lived off of the fruits of other people's labor. And he saw that the large portion of society worked all of its life for almost no benefits, right? You didn't own your work, you didn't own your labor, right? And he thought that this led to conflict between the two classes. He split society into two distinct classes, the proletariat, those who work, and the bourgeoisie, those who control the workers. And he thought that there has to be this inevitable conflict between the two because they are on two sides of the coin, right? So he thought that society was all about class struggle and that eventually there would be this culminating conflict, this culminating war between these two classes. And that is what influenced his political ideas about socialism and communism. Next, we have Emile Durkheim, who you guys have talked about a little with his work on suicide. But he was a French sociologist. And the key thing I want you to get from here is that he heavily utilized empirical research. Okay, do we know what the word empirical means? No? So the word empirical means that it's research-driven. It's observable and it's repeatable. So if you're doing research that's empirical, it means that you're not using logic or you're not using theory, you're using concrete evidence to back up what you're saying and what you're doing. Right? So he did a lot of observations, he analyzed a lot of data, and he was a big early proponent of taking the scientific method and establishing it or utilizing it within society, right? Coming up with a hypothesis that then could be tested and that an experiment that then could be repeated. Okay? And he really wanted to distinguish social science and sociology as a legitimate field. Okay? Because we have this idea that there are hard sciences and soft sciences. Have you guys ever heard of those terms? So things like chemistry and physics, those are hard sciences, right? There's math and there's hard evidence to back them up. Where sociology and psychology, they are often considered soft sciences because they have a lot more to do with theories and a lot more to do with abstract concepts, right? It's not nearly as concrete. But he wanted to kind of flip that. He wanted social science and sociology to be seen as a concrete, as a hard science. And then his seminal work was titled Suicide, which you guys talked about a little bit. Was it last week or the week before? But anyway, he analyzed suicide patterns across society And as we learned, he came up with that, like, men, Protestant white men are the most likely to commit suicide. We talked about some of the underlying factors that have to do with that. Okay. And then the last guy that we're going to talk about is a man by the name of Max Weber. He was a German sociologist philosopher. And he came up after Marx. He is a little bit later on in time, so he had the advantage of taking Marx's ideas and kind of reshaping them and reforming them into his own. So in his view, society was much more complex than simply being the two social classes. Right? Marx believed that there was the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, but Weber said, no, there's a little bit more to society than just who works and who doesn't. He said there's a three-component theory of stratification, and the way he stratified society was based off social class. So this is Marx's ideas, right? There are those at the top who own labor, there is a middle class, and then there's a lower class. But Weber said, no, there are other things that impact how you behave within society. One being status. So if you have a title before your name, like doctor, or duke, or king, or bishop, all these titles that give you prestige, and even though you might be a peasant, you might be a working class member, but if you have that prestige, it can take you to the upper echelons of society. And then also this idea of party. So at this point in time, this is when political parties really start to take hold in Europe, right? Europe, for the most of its history, were mostly monarchies. There wasn't a lot of democratic governing going on, so there was no need for political parties. But at this time, political parties were a big, strong component of society. And he said that the political party that you are a member of has a lot to do with your social standing, a lot to do with where you sit in regard to everyone else. And then he developed this idea called the iron cage. And this was an idea that he viewed the post-industrial world as this system of society that trapped its inhabitants. Okay, so he said that capitalism and industrialization had produced these social forces that worked to preserve industrialization and capitalism. And he said that as these forces worked to preserve the current state of things, people could not escape, right? You couldn't imagine an alternative form of life. So if you can't imagine something, then you can never live it, right? So if you're stuck inside of an industrialized economy, if you're stuck inside capitalism, you can't imagine escaping, so then you never try to challenge it. You never push back against the system, and you're trapped in this proverbial cage where the cycle continues, right? You just live your life, and then your kids live the same life, and their kids live the same life, and society is never able to escape this system. Okay? Are there any questions? Do I need to go back over anything we covered? No? So that's all I have for you guys. It's just the 5 men, and then just make sure you know that sociology came out the reasons, right? So industrialization, secularization, the scientific method, and political upheaval.
We'll hit on these guys multiple times over the course of the semester, so this is just your first introduction to them. And we'll get deeper and deeper details about them as we progress. Sound good? The remainder of the class that you have, if you haven't finished up your discussion pose for chapter 2 in the 10,000 hour rule, this would be a great time to finish that. Sound good? Yeah. We were just talking about social structure and how social structures evolve. We can see that in the magical washing machine, how it provides us the time and opportunity, and it relates to the 10,000 hour rule. And then the map is like a big social structure. You can see, the role of social structure, the way our lives are shaped that way. Yep. Thanks. Very good job.